July 7, 1944. On the burning island of Saipan, an American medical camp sat only a short distance behind the forward line. Inside one canvas tent, wounded men were lying shoulder to shoulder. Some had shrapnel buried in their legs. Some had bandages wrapped around their faces. Some were too weak to even cry out. The air smelled of blood, iodine, sweat, and smoke. Captain Benjamin Salomon stood over one of them, with his sleeves rolled up and his hands covered in blood. He was not supposed to be a frontline killer. He was a medical officer, a dentist by training, a man whose job was to save American soldiers after the battle had already torn them apart. But outside that tent, the battle was not ending. It was coming straight for him. More than 4,000 Japanese soldiers were moving through the darkness, screaming, firing, and charging toward the American lines. It was the final desperate assault of the Japanese defenders on Saipan. Rifles, swords, grenades, bayonets, bamboo spears, anything that could kill was carried forward. The Americans heard them before they saw them. A roar came out of the night. Then shadows appeared, hundreds first, then thousands. The Japanese had been trapped in the northern corner of the island. American forces controlled the land, the sea, and the sky. The Imperial fleet had already been smashed. No rescue was coming. No reinforcements were coming. So the Japanese commander gave the only order left. Attack. Break the American line. Kill as many as possible. Die charging. That morning, the full weight of that order crashed into the 105th Infantry Regiment. Foxholes disappeared under human waves. Machine guns overheated. Riflemen fired until their clips were empty. Grenades exploded so close that men were thrown out of their holes. The first American positions bent, cracked, and then broke. And 50 yards behind those positions, the wounded began crawling toward Salomon's medical tent. He looked up from the soldier on the table. The gunfire was closer now, not distant, not somewhere ahead, right outside. Before Saipan, Benjamin Salomon had lived a very different life. He had graduated from dental school in Los Angeles. He had built a respectable practice. He had steady hands, strong nerves, and a future that should have had nothing to do with Pacific jungles, artillery shells, or men dying in the dirt. But Salomon wanted to serve. When he entered the army, he proved almost immediately that he was not just a doctor with a uniform. He could shoot, he could march, he could lead. He qualified expert with rifle and pistol. He trained with machine guns. He understood fields of fire, cover, movement, and how to keep men alive when everything went wrong. His officers noticed it. His men noticed it faster. They saw a medical man who ran harder than infantrymen, a dentist who knew how to break down a weapon, a quiet officer who could teach tactics better than men who had spent their entire careers in combat units. Then the army made him a dental officer. Salomon did not want that. He wanted infantry. But the army had enough riflemen. It needed doctors and dentists too. So he wore the medical insignia. He treated teeth when he wanted to train with weapons. He served where they placed him. Then Saipan changed everything. The landing was brutal from the beginning. American troops came ashore under heavy fire. The island was filled with caves, ridges, hidden guns, and Japanese defenders who had no intention of surrendering. The battlefield was close, hot, and personal. Men were hit by mortars before they ever saw the enemy. Salomon's dental work became almost meaningless. No one needed a tooth pulled while artillery was ripping men apart. Then the battalion surgeon was wounded. Suddenly, Salomon was needed where the blood was deepest. He volunteered immediately. For 2 weeks he worked inside an aid station near the front. Gunshot wounds, torn limbs, burns, faces ruined by fragments. Men carried in screaming, men carried in silent, men calling for mothers, wives, brothers, God. Salomon worked until his hands cramped. He cut uniforms away from wounds. He stopped bleeding. He pushed morphine syrets into shaking bodies. He marked evacuation tags. He held men still when the pain made them thrash. Some lived because of him. Some died while looking at him. And every day, the Japanese line was pushed farther north. By early July, the enemy was cornered. The Americans knew something was coming. Patrols reported movement. Intelligence officers warned that the Japanese might launch a final attack. The men in the foxholes cleaned their rifles and checked their grenades. They tried to sleep, but could not. Salomon set up his aid station close enough to treat the wounded fast. Too close, some men thought. But that was the point. If a man was bleeding out, 50 yards could decide whether he saw another sunrise. So the medical tent stayed near the line. Canvas walls, folding tables, stretchers, bandages, morphine, and men who could not defend themselves. Then the Japanese came. They poured through a gap between American battalions and hit the rear positions before anyone fully understood what had happened. The first wounded came stumbling in, one hand pressed to a wound, eyes wide, helmet missing. Then 2 more, then 5, then a dozen. Some were carried by friends. Some crawled in on their elbows. Some collapsed at the entrance and had to be dragged inside. Within minutes, Salomon's tent was packed. 30 wounded Americans were inside or around the medical station. He moved from man to man. Pressure here. Hold him down. Get that bandage tighter. Don't let him sleep. Outside, screams mixed with rifle fire. A soldier on a cot grabbed Salomon's sleeve. "Doc, they're inside the line." Salomon did not answer. He already knew. The tent wall flashed with shadows, men running past, men falling. The hard crack of rifles came from every direction. Somewhere close, a Japanese officer screamed orders in the dark. Then the tent flap moved. A Japanese soldier stepped inside. For half a second, no one moved. The man had a bayonet fixed to his rifle. His face was streaked with sweat and dirt. He looked at Salomon, then at the wounded Americans lying helpless on the ground. Then he moved toward one of them. Salomon reached for the nearest rifle. He did not hesitate. The shot exploded inside the tent. The Japanese soldier fell across the canvas floor. A wounded American flinched so hard he nearly rolled off his stretcher. 2 more Japanese soldiers appeared at the entrance. Salomon fired again. One dropped backward. The second stumbled inside, still trying to raise his weapon. Salomon fired into his chest. The tent filled with smoke. For a moment, there was only coughing, crying, and the sound of Salomon working the rifle. Then, the canvas wall moved. Japanese soldiers were crawling under the side of the tent. One came in low with a knife. Salomon kicked his wrist, knocking the blade away, then slammed the butt of the rifle into his face. Another lunged with a bayonet. Salomon drove his own bayonet forward and pinned him to the ground. A third tried to fire from only a few feet away. Salomon twisted sideways as the shot tore through the tent behind him. He smashed the rifle barrel aside and fired point blank. The 4th Japanese soldier made it past him. A wounded American on the floor raised a pistol with both shaking hands. He fired once. The Japanese soldier dropped beside the operating table. Salomon turned slowly. The medical tent was now a battlefield. The floor was slick with blood. The wounded were staring at him, not as a doctor anymore, but as the only armed man between them and death. Outside, the Japanese voices were getting louder. The American line was gone. The aid station would be swallowed next. Salomon understood it in 1 second. If he stayed inside, the wounded would be butchered. If he ran, they would still be butchered. There was only one choice left. He shouted for every man who could move to get out. The wounded looked at him. Some did not understand. Some were too scared to move, so he shouted again. "Go, now, get to the rear." Men began dragging each other toward the back of the tent. One soldier with a bandaged arm lifted another man under the shoulders. A man with shrapnel in his thigh crawled with his teeth clenched. 2 others carried a stretcher between them, stumbling over spent casings and torn canvas. Salomon grabbed another rifle. He stepped through the tent entrance. The world outside was on fire. Japanese soldiers were everywhere. They were running between foxholes, stabbing into shell holes, firing into shadows, climbing over bodies. American soldiers fought back from broken positions. Some were alone, some were in pairs. Some were already dead with their rifles still pointed north. Salomon moved forward, not backward, forward. A Japanese soldier turned toward the medical tent. Salomon shot him. Another came out of the smoke. Salomon shot him too. He passed a wounded American crawling through the dirt. The man looked up at him. "Doc." Salomon did not stop. He could see what would happen if the Japanese reached the rear. Supply dumps, command posts, artillery crews, more aid stations, more men who were not ready for a hand-to-hand fight. Then he saw it. A Browning machine gun sitting near a collapsed position. The crew around it was dead. 4 Americans lay beside the weapon. The gun itself was still there, heavy, ugly, water-cooled, and loaded. Salomon knew that weapon. He had trained on guns like it before the army made him a dental officer. He ran to it, dropped behind the grips, and checked the belt. There was ammunition left. Not enough for a war, enough for a stand. He dragged the machine gun into a better angle, muscles burning, boots slipping in blood and loose dirt. The Japanese were still rushing through the gap. They had no idea a medical officer had just taken control of one of the deadliest weapons on the field. Salomon settled behind the gun. He looked back once. The wounded were still escaping. Slowly. Too slowly. He turned forward. The Japanese charge came at him in waves, and Captain Benjamin Salomon opened fire. The Browning shook under his hands. The first burst cut into the front rank and threw men into the dirt. The second burst swept left. The third swept right. Salomon did not fire wildly. He fired like a trained machine gunner. Short bursts. Controlled movement. Officers first. Riflemen next. Anyone closing the distance. The Japanese charge did not stop. Men climbed over the bodies in front of them and kept coming. The gun hammered against the ground. Brass casings jumped and rolled beside him. Steam hissed from the water jacket. Smoke drifted across his face. His ears rang until the world became nothing but vibration, muzzle flash, and moving targets. Behind him, the wounded men from the medical camp were still trying to reach safety. That was the only clock that mattered. Every second he held the gun, another man crawled farther away. Every burst bought them distance. Every body in front of him became a wall. The Japanese soldiers were close enough now for Salomon to see their faces. Some were young, some looked exhausted. Some were already wounded and still charging because there was nowhere else to go. Their officers screamed them forward with swords raised high. Salomon pressed the trigger again. The Browning roared. A line of men folded into the dirt. A bullet struck near his head and threw sand into his eyes. Another hit the ground under the tripod. Another punched through his sleeve. He felt a hard slap in his leg, looked down and saw blood running into his boot. He had been hit. He did not move away. He shifted his weight, pulled the gun a few inches, and kept firing. The Japanese tried to flank him. Salomon saw the movement and swung the barrel toward it. The gun resisted, heavy and hot. He forced it over. The next burst hit the group from the side. Men fell into one another. One soldier crawled forward with a grenade in his hand. Salomon fired twice. The grenade rolled loose and exploded in front of the position. Dirt and flesh rained down. Salomon ducked, blinked, then rose back onto the grips. The ammunition belt jerked. For one terrible second, the gun stopped. A jam. The Japanese saw it. They surged. Salomon ripped open the cover, fingers moving through blood and oil, cleared the bent round, slammed the weapon shut, and pulled the trigger. The Browning came alive again. The nearest attackers disappeared in the blast. He could hear Americans shouting somewhere behind him. The line was trying to form again. Officers were grabbing survivors and dragging them into new positions. Rifles began firing from scattered holes. Another machine gun opened up far to his left. Artillery shells screamed overhead and burst among the Japanese rear ranks. But the pressure in front of Salomon did not ease. His little piece of ground was still being attacked. He fired until the first belt ran out. Then he grabbed another. His hands were slippery. He could not tell if the blood was his or someone else's. The belt twisted. He forced it. Straight. Loaded. Charged. Fired. A Japanese soldier appeared from behind a dead American, close enough to throw himself at the gun. Salomon saw the flash of a bayonet. He pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The belt had not seated right. The soldier lunged. Salomon let go of the grips, grabbed the rifle beside him, and drove the barrel upward. The bayonet missed his ribs by inches. Salomon smashed his shoulder into the man's chest, knocked him down, then fired a shot through him from almost touching distance. He dropped the rifle and returned to the machine gun. Another round struck him. This one hit his shoulder. Pain flashed white through his body. His right arm went weak. He cursed under his breath, hooked his left hand around the grip, and kept the belt feeding with the wounded arm as best he could. The machine gun became his whole world. Not the island, not the war, not even himself. Only the belt, the barrel, the field of fire, the wounded men behind him. The Japanese came again. This time they crawled low, using the dead as cover. Salomon lowered the barrel and fired into the ground line. Bodies jerked, stopped, and slid backward. One man made it close enough to grab the tripod. Salomon kicked him in the face and fired until the man's hand opened. The heat was savage now. Saipan was a furnace. The sun climbed higher. Smoke trapped the air. The water jacket on the Browning hissed and boiled. The barrel glowed in the haze. Every burst felt like it might be the last before the weapon failed. Salomon fired shorter now. 3 rounds. Pause. 5 rounds. Pause. Another target. Another burst. He was conserving ammunition without even thinking. The training he had been forced to leave behind had returned at the exact moment he needed it. The army had made him a dentist, but it had never taken the infantry out of him. A group of Japanese soldiers broke from the smoke and ran straight at the position. 15, maybe 20. They were screaming as they came. Salomon swung the gun toward them and fired. The first line fell. The second line stumbled over them. The third kept running. The barrel bucked. He leaned into it, teeth clenched, blood running down his neck. The group collapsed less than 20 yards away. 3 men survived the burst. 2 dropped to the ground. 1 kept coming. Salomon tried to traverse the gun, but the tripod had dug into the dirt. The Japanese soldier jumped over a pile of bodies and landed almost on top of the barrel. The machine gun was pointed the wrong way. The bayonet came down. Salomon twisted, took the cut across his arm, and grabbed the hot barrel with both hands. His skin burned instantly. He used the entire machine gun like a club. Steel crashed into the soldier's head. The man dropped. Salomon screamed through his teeth, not from fear, but from the pain in his burned hands. Then he dragged the weapon back into position and loaded the next belt. Behind him, most of the wounded had reached the rear. Not all, but enough. Enough to matter. He could have stopped then. He could have crawled back. He could have said he had done his duty. But the Japanese were still moving through the gap, and if they got through, the next medical station would face the same nightmare. So, Salomon stayed. The battle had become a slaughterhouse. The Japanese banzai charge had ripped through the first lines, but now it was losing shape. The attack had started as a wave. Now it was broken into groups. 10 men here, 20 there. A few crawling through smoke, a few charging with swords. Some stumbling forward with wounds that should have already killed them. Salomon shot them as they appeared. His body was beginning to fail. He felt weak in a way that had nothing to do with tiredness. His vision narrowed at the edges. The gun seemed farther away even though his hands were on it. Blood ran from his leg, his shoulder, his arm. A wound near his face kept dripping into his mouth. He spat red into the dirt. The Japanese charged his old angle. Salomon saw the mistake. He had shifted the gun slightly after the last attack. Now the enemy was moving toward where they thought he had been. He dragged the barrel right and caught them from the flank. The burst tore across the group. Men fell sideways, one after another. More bodies filled the open ground. The machine gun position was now surrounded by the dead. Japanese soldiers lay in front of him in piles. Some were only feet from the tripod. Others were farther out, marking the path of each failed rush. The earth was torn apart with bullets, grenades, and shell fragments. Still, they came. A grenade exploded behind him. The blast shoved him forward onto the gun. For a second, he could not breathe. His ears rang. His chest felt crushed. He pushed himself up anyway and checked the belt. Still feeding. Still alive. He fired again. American artillery was finding its range now. Shells screamed over Salomon's position and burst among the Japanese behind the charge. The explosions threw bodies into the air. Dirt columns rose and fell. The pressure finally began to break. Some Japanese soldiers turned back. Others refused. Those who kept coming came straight into Selamun's gun. He fired until another belt ran out. Then he reached for the next one and found only a small length left, maybe 100 rounds, maybe less. He looked behind him. The medical camp was almost empty now. Torn canvas, overturned tables, blood trails leading away, abandoned bandages blowing in the wind. The patients he had protected were gone. That should have been victory. But Selamun could see Japanese soldiers still probing through smoke near the beach road. They were searching for another opening, another soft place, another group of wounded men who could not fight back. He loaded the last belt. His fingers barely obeyed him. A bullet struck his side. He folded over the gun, gasped, and nearly fell. Then he straightened. The Japanese were close again. He pressed the trigger. The last belt began to disappear into the receiver, round by round, second by second, life by life. Selamun's world narrowed to the final strip of ground in front of the barrel. He no longer knew how many men he had killed. He no longer knew how many wounds were in his own body. He only knew the gun was still firing, and as long as it fired, the Japanese could not pass. The charge was dying now. Not quietly, not cleanly. It died screaming into machine gun fire, artillery bursts, rifle shots, and the ruined sand of Saipan. Then, through the smoke, Selamun saw another group forming. They were fewer this time, but they were coming straight for him. He looked down at the belt, almost gone. He pulled the gun tighter into his burned hands, and waited for them to close the distance. The last Japanese attack came through smoke and dust. They were not a wave anymore. They were survivors of a wave. Men with torn uniforms, blood on their faces, rifles in their hands, and nothing left to lose. They had watched thousands go forward. They had watched artillery tear holes through their ranks. They had watched the American line bend and somehow still hold. Now they saw one machine gun still firing. One American behind it, one man blocking the path. They came for him. Selamun let them get closer. He had to. The belt was almost empty. Every round had to count. 30 yards, 25, 20. He pressed the trigger. The Browning kicked hard. The burst cut through the center of the group. Men dropped, but the rest kept moving. Selamun shifted left and fired again. The gun sputtered. The belt jumped. Only a few rounds remained. A Japanese soldier fell forward and rolled almost to the base of the position. Another crawled over him. Selamun fired once. The man stopped. The gun clicked. Empty. For the first time since he had reached the position, the Browning was silent. Selamun grabbed for a rifle. His hand found nothing but dirt, blood, and spent brass. The nearest Japanese soldier was already climbing over the bodies in front of him. Selamun pulled his pistol. He fired. One shot. The soldier dropped. Another appeared behind him. Selamun fired again. The pistol jammed or emptied. There was no time to check. The next soldier lunged with a bayonet. Selamun caught the rifle with both burned hands. The blade cut into him. He held on anyway. For one violent moment, doctor and enemy soldier were locked together over the dead machine gun. Then another shot cracked from somewhere behind the American line. The Japanese soldier jerked and fell. Selamun tried to turn, but his legs gave out. He collapsed across the Browning. His hands landed near the grips. His body had nothing left. The battlefield around him continued for a while longer. Rifle fire, artillery, men shouting, Japanese holdouts being pushed back, American units reforming from shattered pieces. The final banzai charge on Saipan had spent itself against broken foxholes, desperate infantrymen, and one medical officer who refused to let his patients die. By the time the sun was high, the Japanese assault was finished. The cost was horrific. The 1st and 2nd battalions of the 105th Infantry had been torn apart. Companies that had been full the day before could barely gather a handful of men. Officers counted survivors and stopped speaking when the numbers came in. Medics moved from body to body, searching for anyone still breathing. The medical camp Selamun had defended was wrecked. The tent was ripped open. Tables were overturned. Bandages were scattered across the ground. Blood marked the path where wounded men had crawled away from death. Most of them survived. They survived because Salomon had stood between them and the charge. For hours, no one knew what had happened to him. The last men who saw him alive remembered him walking out with a rifle. Then they remembered the sound of the machine gun. Long bursts at first, then shorter ones, then single bursts spaced apart. Then, silence. The area near his position was too dangerous to reach immediately. Japanese snipers and wounded holdouts still hid among the bodies and shell holes. American patrols advanced carefully, checking every crater, every trench, every corpse that might still hold a grenade. Then they found the machine gun. It was still pointed toward the Japanese line. Around it lay a terrible semicircle of bodies. Japanese soldiers were piled so thick in front of the barrel that the patrol stopped walking. One soldier whispered, "What happened here?" No one answered. They moved closer. Slumped over the gun was an American captain. His uniform was soaked dark. His hands were still near the weapon. His body was torn by bullets, bayonets, and fragments. The patrol leader checked his identification. Captain Benjamin L. Salomon, Dental Corps, Battalion Surgeon. For a moment, the men just stared. A dentist. A medical officer. The man who should have been behind the line with bandages and morphine had died behind a machine gun. Then they started counting. The bodies in front of him told the story better than any witness could. 10, 20, 30. The count kept climbing. 40, 50, 60. Some Japanese soldiers had fallen almost on top of the weapon. Others lay farther out in the killing zone. They had charged, fallen, and been climbed over by the next men. The ground showed where Salomon had shifted the gun. Blood trails showed he had moved while wounded, dragging himself and the weapon to keep a better angle. The final count reached 98 enemy dead in front of his position. 98, not from a squad, not from a platoon, from one man who had walked out of a medical camp and taken over a machine gun. Then they counted his wounds. They found gunshots in his arms, legs, chest, shoulder, and body. They found bayonet cuts and punctures. Some wounds were old enough to show he had fought on after receiving them. Others were close, brutal, personal. The evidence was clear. He had not died quickly. He had fought while wounded again and again. He had kept firing until his body could no longer obey him. The survivors from the medical tent told what they had seen. They described the Japanese soldier entering the tent, Salomon grabbing a rifle, the hand-to-hand fighting, the order to evacuate, the way he stepped outside alone while the wounded dragged each other toward the rear. Their stories matched. So did the battlefield. A report was prepared. Witness statements were gathered. The machine gun position was mapped. The enemy dead were counted. Salomon's wounds were documented. The conclusion seemed obvious to every man who saw the evidence. This was Medal of Honor action. But war does not always reward heroes quickly. Salomon was a medical officer. Under the rules as they were understood at the time, medical personnel were protected non-combatants. They could carry weapons for defense, but using a machine gun raised questions. Some officers believed he had crossed a line. They argued that a man wearing medical insignia could not be honored for fighting as an infantryman, even if he had done it to save wounded patients. So the recommendation was denied. The paperwork stopped. The medal did not come. His family received the news that he had been killed on Saipan. They heard pieces of the story later, from men who survived because of him. But official recognition disappeared into files, delays, and arguments over rules written far from the battlefield. Years passed. The war ended. The island became quiet. The men who survived Saipan went home. Some married, some had children, some never spoke of the island again. But the wounded men from that medical camp never forgot the officer who gave them time to escape. They knew exactly what he had done. He had not picked up the gun for glory. He had not charged forward because he wanted to kill. He had done it because wounded men were about to be bayoneted in a medical tent. He had done it because someone had to stand in the gap. Decades later, the case was reopened. Historians, army officers, dental corps leaders, and advocates examined the evidence again. The old question returned. Had Salomon violated the rules of war, or had he defended helpless patients when no one else could? This time, The answer was different. A medical officer had the right to defend himself and his patients. Silamon had not abandoned medicine. He had carried it to its most brutal edge. He had killed so the wounded could live. In 2002, 58 years after Saipan, the United States finally awarded Captain Benjamin L. Silamon the Medal of Honor. The medal came too late for him, too late for his parents, too late for many of the men who had fought beside him, but not too late for the truth. His story became one of the most haunting in American military history. A dentist who wanted to be a soldier, a medical officer who became a shield, a healer who picked up a machine gun when the enemy entered his aid station. On Saipan, over 4,000 Japanese soldiers charged the American lines in one of the largest banzai attacks of the Pacific War. Hundreds of Americans were killed or wounded. Entire units were shattered. The island was bought in blood. But inside that chaos, one story still stands apart. 30 wounded Americans were alive because one man refused to leave them. 98 enemy soldiers lay in front of his gun. His own body carried the price, and for 58 years, his country struggled to say what every survivor already knew. Captain Benjamin Silamon had earned the medal the moment he stepped out of that medical tent. He was not just a dentist, not just a doctor, not just a soldier. He was the man who walked out of an American medical camp with a machine gun and held back a charge that should have killed every wounded man behind him. Most people have never heard his name. That is why stories like this matter, because war history is not only about generals, maps, and famous battles. It is about the forgotten men in the smoke, the men who had seconds to choose, the men who looked at death, looked behind them at the helpless, and decided they would not move. Captain Benjamin L. Silamon died on Saipan on July 7, 1944. He saved his patients, he held his ground, and when the machine gun finally went silent, the wounded men he protected were still alive. So remember his name, Captain Benjamin L. Silamon, the medical officer who became a warrior, the healer who fought until the last round, the man who turned a broken machine gun position into a wall between 4,000 Japanese soldiers and an American medical camp. Hit like for him, not for us. Subscribe if you want more forgotten war stories like this, stories pulled from battlefields, medal citations, and the blood-soaked corners of history where courage was almost buried forever.